Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. We just have a few more people trying to get into the webinar, including a few of our speakers. So we're just going to give it a few more minutes, but we are here, we are live. Great to have you here, and we'll kick things off just in a moment. Okay, I think we'll kick things off. Thanks everybody for joining. As I said, good morning and good afternoon. Thank you for joining this second in our IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management Oceania webinar series. In the spirit of reconciliation, the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and across the Pacific, their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend our deep respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. For those who don't know me, I'm Guy Williams. I'm the host for today's webinar. I serve as the current Oceania Regional Chair of the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management, and I'm a member of the IUCN CEM Oceania Regional Committee. We're really excited today to present the second in our Oceania webinar series on the topic of bushfires and ecosystem management. We have a fantastic list of speakers, which includes experts on Aboriginal cultural burning, ecosystem response to fire, remote sensing and climate change. This webinar follows last year's first webinar, which was on nature-based solutions. And before we kick things off, I really welcome all of you to get in touch in regards to joining IUCN CEM, the Oceania Regional Committee, and also any ideas you might have for future webinars to continue this series that we have going. Next slide, please, Mariana. We have, as I mentioned, a full agenda of presentations, which will take up most of our time. We are going to allow sufficient time for questions and answer. Please use the question function throughout the presentations to keep them coming in, and we'll keep a record of those. We'll obviously be keeping a record of this event, which will be shared with you. And as I said, we're happy to kind of continue the conversation if time gets the better of us. I'd like to just now hand over, next slide, please, hand over to Pete Smith, the IUCN Vice Chair for Oceania. Next slide, please. Over to you, Pete.
Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are on the planet. My name's Pete Smith. I'm speaking today on behalf of Angela Andrades, who's the chair for CEM, IUCN. I'm the vice chair, Oceania, on the steering committee. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of, for those of you who don't know about the Commission on Ecosystem Management, our vision, mission, our goals, and our bit of our plan for the next 4 years. So in this first slide here, the vision for CEM is about productive and resilient ecosystems, and that contribute to human health, well-being, and ecosystem and sustainable development. Now, the mission is mostly about looking at to develop and share expertise related to ecosystem-based applications of ecosystem management. A key focus are aspects like nature-based solutions, looking at aspects like biodiversity conservation, and looking at issues related to addressing climate change impacts, and contribute to human well-being and promote sustainable development. The objective is for us to actually look at, provide guidance. So the Commission is a group of volunteers who try and look at providing, using their own expertise to help provide technical guidance to IUCN members and generally in terms of the conservation biology community. So if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, the structure is fairly simple. There's a fairly flat structure to CEM. There is a chair who's Angela Andrades. Then there is a deputy chair and vice chairs representing a number of the regions. So there's a vice chair for Oceania, which is me, a vice chair for Africa, multiple regions with Africa, a vice chair for Asia, vice chair for Europe, Western Europe, vice chair for North America, and a vice chair for the Central America, Caribbean, and Latin America. So that forms the steering committee. But the real focus of the work that's done by CEM is in the two areas of the technical leads and the regional chairs. Now, the technical leads include people who are thematic leaders, specialist groups, and task forces. And the regional chairs represent the region, the IUCN region. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so you look from this slide, I've actually got it on too small a screen for me to see. Okay, so Oceania is one of the larger in terms of spatial distribution regions, and it doesn't show up well under this map. This is the map that Angela sent me. If I was going to focus it from an Oceania, I'd have Oceania in the center. This map sort of misses out on many of our member states. We might be a large distribution. We have a very significant marine environment, of course, because being Oceania, but our members are relatively small. We're one of the smaller areas. The only ones smaller than us are Eastern Europe and West Asia. But in terms of overall representation, we don't have a large number of members. Can we go to the next slide, please? So these are the CEM technical groups. Now, I apologize for those of you who are colorblind, but there are thematic groups, specialist groups, and task forces. So under the thematic groups, there's things like nature-based solutions, socio-ecological systems and transformation. There's a new one called climate change and biodiversity policy and practice. If we look down those list, I've got some that are in bold and in green, such as ecosystem services, red list of ecosystems, ecological compensation and climate mitigation. If we look at the specialist task groups, coastal and marine and island, those ones that I've got in bold and green are where an Oceania member is the thematic lead or the task force leader. So even though we have small numbers of people, a small representation in the CEM membership, we sort of punch above our weight in terms of the activity of CEM members across the CEM portfolio. So the thematic groups are looking at cross-sectoral type issues related. Those topics are fairly self-explanatory. The specialist groups tend to be focused on particular ecosystems. And then the task forces are related to very specific issues like systemic pesticides, the fisheries expert group, and there's the deep sea mining type thing. So if we look at the CEM for the next intersessional period, so for the 2021 to 2024, the priority areas for CEM are these 7 groups. So nature-based solutions, the red list of ecosystems, of which we have the thematic leads here today going to be giving you a talk later on. Restoration is one of the priority areas, cultural practices, socio-ecological systems and transformation is one, ecosystem services, human health and ecosystems, and social ecological resilience and transformation. They're the 7 priority areas that the chair has decided that we would focus on in particular in CEM. That does not mean that the others are not important. They're just a focus for the next 4 years. But all of those other areas, so the thematic groups look at cross-sectional type issues. The specialist groups are trying to look at providing technical guidance and advice on those particular ecosystems. So I think I'll finish there on that next slide. So I won't take up too much more of your time. I'm only speaking on behalf of Angela. If you're interested in CEM, the membership is now open again. If you go to the website at the moment, there's no members because they're now renewing the membership. They're renewing all the thematic leads. They're renewing the regional chairs. Guy's been given his letter of offer now to become the regional chair for Oceania. So I would encourage people to look at the CEM website and look at and lining up for their membership. So I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, just echoing what Pete said, really encourage all of you to reach out to either Pete, myself, or through the IUCN CEM website, just in terms of getting in touch. There's so much scope to the work that we're doing at the moment, and we really welcome your input. So over to our fantastic webinar speakers we have today. Please stay with us. As I said, we've got some time for question and answers at the end. Next slide, please. So our first speaker is Den Barber. Den's got more than 20 years experience in cultural heritage and environmental management with New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, and as a ranger and Aboriginal co-management officer. Since 2010, Den has initiated a number of cultural burning projects. He's also the founding director and cultural fire practitioner for Kuri Cultural Fire Aboriginal Corporation. We're really lucky to have Den with us today. Over to you, Den.
Well, thank you, Guy, and thank you to all the organisers of this webinar. I feel rather privileged to be able to talk on a subject close to my heart, and certainly something that I'm very interested in seeing progressed, certainly in what we're faced with in terms of well, climate change, but also the fires that the wildfires that we're seeing right around the globe. So without further ado, just next slide, please. Just a bit of a cultural warning to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be viewing this presentation today, of the people that have passed away. Next, please. It's also important for me to acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past and present of many of the nations from right around not only Australia, but of course those overseas, right around the globe. And of course, it's important for me to acknowledge our Sky Father Creator and the good ancestral spirits, and to the very thing that sustains us all, and that's our mother. She provides us with everything that we need. Thank you. Okay, so who am I? Well, as I was introduced as the founding director for Kuri Country Cultural Fire Aboriginal Corporation, I also have my own private business, Yarrabin Cultural Connections Proprietary Limited, in which both of those entities I engage and have been engaged in the cultural burning space for the last 11 years. Prior to that, I was a professional firefighter for National Parks, New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service. And it was only 11 years ago that I was introduced, if you like, to cultural burning by the elders up in Kukataipan country of Cape York, and that's where my journey began. and continue to learn from many of my elders here in New South Wales, in Southeast Australia, particularly out in Western New South Wales with regards to the ancient practice of cultural burning. And the country that I have visited and burnt in is as diverse as the many different Aboriginal groups right across Australia. And there's no one size fits all or one method fits all. Cultural burning is very much about burning to the many different systems that we find ourselves in. It's also important for me to acknowledge that I am a traditional custodian of the people from Mudgee of Wiradjuri country. These days I'm living on the beautiful central coast of New South Wales in Dark and Young country. So once again, I pay my respects to the local country and to the elders of this place. Next, please. Unlike the photo before where I'm just sitting there very calmly surrounded by my cultural fire that I've just put in, these images I took on the 17th of October 2013. From memory, I believe it was the 17th. In any case, it was that year when I was employed with National Parks, and I received a phone call that I needed to go into the park and alert any of the people that might have been in the national park that a wildfire had broken out some 10 to 15 kilometres or 20 kilometres from that national park. And the fear was that this wildfire that you see in these images was going to sweep its way south and into the park. The westerly winds, very ferocious, very high intensity winds. A wildfire had already started some weeks before in a place called Lithgow to the west, and you can see some of that smoke to the left of the screen. But the smoke in the foreground is actually fire that I believe started from an electrical line that hit the ground, and the available fuel load, and of course the high temperatures that day with the severe or the fire rating being extreme with the high winds. It was a combination for this disaster to take place. And for me, being up on that lookout and looking towards this fire at that time was really a turning point for me, that I really believed that it was time to really start pushing what I had learnt some 3 years earlier, and that the practice of reintroducing cultural burning. And this was, you could say, my turning point. Next slide, please. Here it's just important to point out, and as many of you would know, Aboriginal people have been in this country for thousands of years. Some, you hear different numbers given, 20,000, 40,000, 60, 80, 120. Aboriginal people believe we've been here since the beginning. And the tangible evidence of Aboriginal people occupation in Australia can be seen everywhere. Notably in the Greater Blue Mountains World Heritage Area where I was working, I was privileged to be taken to many sites throughout that 1.3 million hectares of country and see sites just like this, see the tangible evidence of the Aboriginal people that were there, leaving their mark, if you like, the tangible mark. And that can be found in many different places throughout. And it's just an indication of the length of time, and the archaeological record will vouch for that as well. So if we just flick to the next slide, please. And more recently, a book was written by this gentleman called Bill Gamage, who was not an Aboriginal man, but went to great lengths to go back over the historical record, or the most recent historical record, at least that since 1788, in the 230 plus years that Australia has been, if you like, colonised, when invasion, if you like, took place. It spelt the beginning of the way of life for Aboriginal people right across this continent. And this book actually captures a lot. He went to great lengths to capture the evidence written down by many of the early explorers, if you call them that, those that were surveying the country, those that were following the many river systems in the internal parts of New South Wales and beyond. And they were writing in their journals and the things that they were recording. Not only that, the artists that were engaged in capturing the scenery, capturing the landscape. Bill Gamage has done a great job in collecting all of that and providing evidence to suggest that the Australian landscape, as it is described in this book, as being a gentleman's estate. And that was a comment or an observation that was given by many early colonial, as I say, explorers and those venturing across the landscape. And one such example is the next slide, please. T.L. Mitchell, who was a Surveyor General at the time, moving across and throughout the eastern river systems in New South Wales and beyond. This, I won't read that verbatim, but basically he's making that observation of how the country looked and how open it was. Also seeing people, particularly women and children, burning the grass. This is a very typical example of the sort of things that were being written down. Next, please. I've highlighted this taken from the fire stories. It was the story of the 1957 Lura fires and A Lesson in Time. And it's basically a list of the more recent huge fire events that have been taking place in this country, and particularly in the Blue Mountains specifically, since 1957. And I won't read all of those statistics, but you can see, you know, the lives lost, the homes destroyed, the country, and more importantly, that's been destroyed time and time again by the wildfires that have ravaged not only the Blue Mountains, but you know, right across this continent. And it's quite a telling list of statistics, as you can see. Next slide, please. And more recently, many of you would still remember the, you know, only less 2 years ago, the Black Summer wildfires, as they are described, and particularly in this region of New South Wales, what we call the Gospers Mountain, where it started in the middle of the Wallamai National Park and merged with what they called the Little Eel Complex fire in Yango National Park, and they became the mega fire that destroyed vast tracts of land. And all of that country is now currently in, if you like, self-repair, but it's, you know, quite devastating. And to see it, it's at very early stages of it coming back to anything like it was. Just next slide, please. And there was a government's response to since in the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry recommendation, and it was recommendation 26. And I will read this one, that in order to increase the respectful, collaborative and effective use of Aboriginal land management practices in planning and preparing for bushfire, government commit to pursuing greater application of Aboriginal land management, including cultural burning, through a program to be coordinated by Aboriginal Affairs and Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, working in partnership with Aboriginal communities. This should be accompanied by a program of evaluation alongside the scaled up application of these techniques. Now, for me, it's wonderful to see that recommendation was caught up in the inquiry. There's only one thing missing, and that is the word leading. And I would really love to see that word used, because Aboriginal people need to be leading this practice and leading this with government as a partner, because this suggests that this in my way of seeing, this particular recommendation doesn't capture that. It almost sounds like it's something that, you know, government will use, you know, certainly respectfully apparently, but use Aboriginal practices to achieve the aims of, you know, bushfire management. But where I sit, it's important that Aboriginal people take the lead on that. Next slide, please. I'll come to these photos in a moment, but I think that the gist of my presentation today is not to explain what cultural burning is. My message in this webinar for everyone who may be viewing is to entertain the notion that because of the forced removal of Aboriginal people that's been happening for 230 plus years in this country, and I'm not here to give a history lesson either, but of course it all began with you know, the 1788 invasion, settlement, if you like, colonisation, where, you know, it began with Aboriginal people being, first of all, affected by introduced disease. Then, of course, there's the issue of being forcibly, you know, moved off country, issues around massacres, the impact on Aboriginal people in these last 230 years. Particularly in this part of Australia, but right across Australia, of course, no doubt. Excuse me. There's obviously, that tells you something, that people that were here for thousands of years as intrinsically connected to their environment that they lived in day to day, not excluded from it, but in it, are no longer on that country. And this has led to what we're faced with today, and has been happening for decades now, the repeat impact of wildfires. And this is why we're talking about the return of something that was practiced in this country for thousands of years. That is the key point, the key message from me, is that we need to somehow find a way of getting people back on country. We are the missing element. There are issues around the wilderness debate about, you know, excluding people from these wild landscapes, but that was never the case in Australia. There is no wilderness. There'll be plenty of people who want to have an argument with me over that. But as I said, the tangible evidence is everywhere to be seen as to where Aboriginal people lived and where they practiced their culture, and in particular cultural burning. Just going back to these pictures here, you'll see fire in the background on the picture to the left. And that is in fact fire that I've put in, but not a cultural fire by any means. This was in my time with national parks, when I used to conduct hazard reduction burns with many of my colleagues and my crew members using a drip torch, and it was about efficiency. And that drip torch carried that fire line right across along the fire trail. And as I moved ahead of the fire front along the fire trail, I came across these beautiful native fruits, and you can see what we call a G-bung on the left on the picture of the right. And to the right of that same picture, there's these things we call native grapes. And the fruit was in abundance. But, you know, I've just had this realization at this point that we've just put fire on the ground and we're burning this country. Now, of course, that fruit didn't survive the fire. And that was another telling day for me that this is all so wrong. You know, traditional sense, we would never have burnt that country. So that's a slide that I often use in many of my presentations to make that point. The cultural burning is something that was done with a lot of consideration for country and the systems that we were in and what was happening on that country at any given time. And that's certainly not the case when it comes to hazard reductions, and certainly wildfire doesn't recognise that at all as well. Next slide, please. So this is what you might expect to see at a cultural burn these days. And here I am running a workshop. You can see fire behind me there, spots of what we call single ignition points. I have an audience of men, women and young children observing and learning the practice. The picture on the left is a photo that was taken, I think, a couple of months after the initial burn. You can see the amount of organic material that's still left behind, and these wonderful new shoots. I believe that's Lamandra popping up after our burn, and that is the kind of thing you'd like to see. We do often see that after our cultural burns, and that is the objective. Certainly not to obliterate everything and have fire surrounding us. It's a very relaxed environment that we create with the burning. Next, please. I believe we're going to come to question and answer time, and I've probably used up all of my time. But as I said before I wind up, this presentation was not about telling you what cultural burning is. It is ultimately a cultural practice, and Aboriginal people should be given the opportunity to partake in this cultural practice. And we're happy, obviously, to share it as well, because it is not suggesting it is the panacea or the silver bullet to resolve the issues around the issues around wildfires, but it certainly needs to be considered as part of the response. That's basically what I'm advocating for, and certainly carrying out when I can. And I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Really appreciate it. And as we said, we're going to allow time for Q&A at the end. So please stay with us. We've got some questions coming through already, which are really relevant to what you're talking about. So we'll just keep moving on. So the next speaker we have following Dan is David Keith. David Keith is a professor of botany in the Centre for Ecosystem Science at the University of New South Wales. David has studied fire ecology for more than 30 years. And is currently working with the New South Wales Bushfire Research Hub. So without further ado, over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Guy. Could I have the first slide of mine when you're ready, Mariana? Just to give you, thanks for that. We'll go to the next slide, which is just a brief outline. I wanted to cover some context first and talk about fire in Australia, and in particular, the fires from 2019-20. And then I want to give some context of Australian ecosystems in their place in the world. And then an overview quickly on the fire effects on ecosystems, particularly of the 2019-20 event, and pick out some case studies of ecosystem resilience and collapse, and then finally a few words about ecosystem management and restoration. Next one, thanks. So before we go anywhere, I wanted to introduce a concept that was coined by Malcolm Gill quite a while ago now, and it's stuck very well because it's an incredibly useful concept for thinking about fires, the fire regime, which involves breaking it down into 4 components: frequency, intensity, season, and type of events. And you can see very different looking fires there on the left-hand side of the screen. And the bottom one there is actually a substrate fire, a fire that is the poor cousin of the 4. It doesn't get much mention. We'll be talking a little bit about it later on today. And you can think about those different components being arranged in landscapes. Okay, so any point in the landscape has a particular frequency, intensity, and season and type of fire. Next slide. And in a global context, lots of different parts of the world are fire prone, and Australia is up there with the most fire prone continents on Earth. And you can see from this map on the left that there's actually a wide range of very contrasting fire regimes across the continent that vary in frequency, season, and severity, and even type, right across the continent, in part reflecting climatic variation. And the other point worth making is that there's strong evidence from charcoal deposits and also phylogenies of species that have been studied, and large groups of taxa, plant families, and so on, that suggest that fire has had a very long history in Australia. Before people arrived, in fact, before people evolved. And of course, throughout that history of 65 plus million years, fire regimes have been changing continually through that process. They changed when people first arrived. They changed again when Europeans arrived, and they're changing as we speak. Next slide, please. The 1920 fires, they broke all sorts of records in recorded history, which is actually not very long in terms of the history of fire and history of people in Australia. But as far as we know, they're amongst the lowest and driest conditions in recorded history in Eastern Australia, at least at the time. They're amongst the most extensive fires, burning 10.3 million hectares in temperate Australia alone. there was a much greater area actually that was burned in the tropics, but that happens in most years actually. What's unusual is that so much area burnt in temperate Australia, and finally that this area was not only large, but it involved a very large area of high severity fires. And Beck Gibson will be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. And I wanted to put Australian ecosystems in a global context. Next slide, please, Marianne. Thanks. And to do that, I wanted to refer to the new global ecosystem typology that's been released by IUCN. And you can, I encourage you to go onto the website here and have a surf around and explore ecosystems of the world. But it's a useful framework for describing our ecosystems here in Australia. Next slide, please. So in terms of the impact of the fire, the global ecosystem typology describes 7 major biomes of ecosystems around the world, and all 7 of those in Australia were affected by these fires in one way or another. And I've circled them there according to red or orange yellow in terms of the depth of effects of these recent fires. And it's actually the temperate forests, the shrublands or heathlands as we sometimes know them, the palustrine wetlands and in particular bogs, and also freshwater streams that are probably amongst the most affected. But other kinds of ecosystems were also burnt. Next slide, please. Now, we did a study to assess the post-fire effects of those fires right across Australia, both in the southeast and also the southwest and South Australia as well. And to do that, we developed a framework that considered fire-related threats to biodiversity in the context of the whole fire regime, and also other processes that interact with fire and affect biodiversity indirectly that way. So we divided the fire-related threats into 4 groups and defined 15 different types. And you see those 4 groups colour-coded in the table there. And amongst those, we were able to identify 13 spatial indicators for 10 of the threats. So there are some threats that we weren't able to represent with sufficient spatial data because it doesn't exist at this point. But the majority of them we were able to find indicators that were reasonably reliable. And across Australia, we identified 95 different types of ecosystems that we picked out for study because A, there was suitable data, but also these 95 either had some a priori threatened status or had some traits that enabled us to think, well, these could be threatened by fire. So as a group, we estimated the sensitivity of each of those 95 ecosystem types to these 15 different types of threats where we could, and we estimated the exposure to the threats as a consequence of the 2019-20 fires based on the intersection of the extent of the fires, the extent of the indicators of the threats, and finally the extent of the ecosystem distribution. Next slide. So this diagram gives you a quick synopsis of the outcome of that analysis, and you'll see here that the threats in the A group, it's the direct fire regime threats, are represented up top here. The interactions between fire and the physical environment in B on the right here. On the bottom is C, which is the interaction between fire and biological processes, and D, a couple of threats that relate to the interaction directly between human activity and fire. And the short story is that high fire frequency was a threat that really stood out as affecting lots of ecosystems of quite different types, and also affecting a large proportion of their ranges. And post-fire droughts were also very influential on the status of systems as a result of that last fire. And the next indicator below that is the effect post-fire drought, and you can see that that was insignificant compared to the pre-fire drought. So we actually had a lot of rain after that fire event. And the third sort of one is the interaction between fire and exotic or invasive predators, particularly cats and foxes. But some other feral pests, such as herbivores, deer in particular, and horses in localised area were also important. So the threats that didn't seem to be that important this time around were post-fire drought, post-fire erosion, post-fire weed invasion, as far as our data could tell us. But I have to say the data was pretty weak on this particular process. And finally, yeah, fairly modest impacts as far as we could detect on the interactive effects of fire and logging or fire and fragmentation. And processes such as the interaction of fire severity and also herbivores were sitting in the middle between those two groups, intermediate level of influence. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one I just want to do an overview of the structure. Back to the big table. Thanks, Mariana. So here you'll see colours that represent the degree of exposure to different kinds of threats, and the rows all represent different kinds of ecosystems. And this big flash of red colour in the bottom sort of left-hand side there is a group of humid pyric forests. It's our wet sclerophyll forests, the tall eucalypt forests. And so that's a particular group of ecosystems that really had a major impact on the consequence of fires. And the groups directly above them are groups of temperate rainforests. They've also had a hiding. And the other one worth a mention is down in the bottom right, which are the peatland ecosystems. Okay, so let's go on and have a look at some examples of this. Next slide, please. So first up, I want to talk about the tropical lowland rainforests, which in a global scheme are small fragment of global distribution here in Australia, and especially in southeastern Australia. Next slide, please. They're an ecosystem that doesn't burn often, and when it does, there can be very substantial impacts. But the short story with this one is that even though there were very substantial impacts related to top kill of the trees and opening of the canopy, there's actually a relatively small area of this particular group exposed to the recent fires. At most, a little over 10% of the distribution in southeastern Australia was affected by the fires, which is still significant because these are very important systems, and pretty much every patch is unique. So I want to understate the importance of this forest burning, and more importantly, it predisposes those forests to further impacts the next fire season. Next slide, please. The next group I wanted to mention was these wet forests dominated by eucalypts, which, as you can see here from the global map, are much unique to southeastern and a tiny bit of southwestern Australia, and nowhere else. Next slide, please. The one that I wanted to look at as an example is one dominated by Alpine Ash, which occurs down in the southeast of, in the highest forested country of Australia. And these were forests that were really significantly affected by this particular fire event. In fact, 40%, fifths of the distribution had been exposed to 2 successive fires within the last half century. And given that these forests are types of forests that have eucalypts, special and unusual eucalypts that are actually killed by fire, and they don't resprout like most other species do, a short succession of fires like this really has very serious impacts on these ecosystems, and they're not likely to recover from a succession of events like that for, well, centuries. In a single fire, it can take 100 years for the usual successional forest process to play out. So these are forests that were really very seriously impacted by recent fire events. Next one, please. Okay, so the next one is a group of fire forests, and I've got an example from Kangaroo Island, which you may have heard was very, severely burnt in the fire events. But this is a dry sclerophyll forest system, which generally has lower sensitivity to severe fires and can tolerate fires at shorter frequencies, if you like, than the wet sclerophyll forests. They can be impacted, but this particular one, even though a substantial portion of its range was burnt, there's a substantial portion over here on the mainland that didn't burn. And furthermore, the portion that did on Kangaroo Island had not been burnt, that frequently prior to that event. So although there's certainly some impacts, the level of impact is somewhat less in this, and we have a more resilient kind of response in this system than we do for the wet eucalypt forests. Next one, Mariana. Going further west to the Stirling Range, and on top of the Stirling Range, there's a very unique heathland system. Heathland systems are very resilient to fire and very fire prone, but this particular one is in real trouble because it's been very frequently in recent times. In fact, there was a major fire that burnt 3/4 of the distribution of this mountaintop heathland in 2018. And then it got another fire in 2019, just a year later, that burnt almost all of the rest of the range and with some overlap as well. So some very short fire intervals exposed to this heathland. But what's even more concerning is that this is infected by a disease called root rot that's caused by a water mould, and fire actually increases the impact of that disease and makes the disease more prone to be aggressively infecting the vegetation. And we're actually losing species from that heathland as we speak, with species like this one having catastrophic declines. And these data don't actually show the impact of the last two fires. This one is literally on a knife edge. So this ecosystem is literally pushed to the brink of collapse by a succession of fires, not a single fire event. Next one, please. And finally, I wanted to talk about some peatlands. Now, a lot of people don't even realise that there are peatlands in Australia, but there are. It's just that they're very, very restricted and very marginal climatically. The real sort of home for these kinds of ecosystems, as you can see, is right across the boreal latitudes of the world. But we do have some here in southeastern Australia and even in the southwest. Next slide, please. And some of those were quite severely affected by the fires, including this one on the Nunes Plateau. And you can see in the photographs two examples there of a response. On the left-hand side is a fairly resilient response where land has recovered quite rapidly. This is just 10 weeks after the fire in 2019, and you can see recovery of lots of plant growth there, and the swamp actually flowers away. And it's actually a very important resource because it's the first fresh regrowth that arrives in a landscape after a fire event. And on the right-hand side, something wrong has happened. In fact, that system on the right has collapsed, and you find some swamps that look like the one on the right and the one on the left. So some have collapsed and some are resilient. And the key to understanding the two of them both burning the same fire is the hydrological change that's occurred as a consequence of underground mining, which has disrupted the water table beneath some of these swamps and essentially come out. And you can see in this graph here a comparison between the biomass of the regrowth in the first 10 weeks after the fire. It's more than 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times greater in the functional unmined swamps than it is in the collapsed mine swamps. A complicated kind of interaction there where mining has actually eroded the resilience of the system to fire. Okay, last slide, please, Mariana. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think what we do see from these recent fires is that there's an incredible diversity of ecosystems affected and a diversity of very different responses from all the way from substantial resilience to ecosystem collapse. And these negative effects on biodiversity and ecosystem function are not usually just explainable by a single fire event. Okay, they actually depend on the context in terms of the whole fire regime. In other words, the fires that have gone before and their patterns of severity and season, as well as the intervals between successive fire, and also the interaction with other kinds of threats, such as drought, invasive species, and human disturbance, such as the underground mining example we just saw in the Peatlands. So in terms of what we can do about, the worst of these impacts, I think, number one, top priority is climate change mitigation. And we're not going to see the benefits of the strongest action that could be taken right now, as of today. But the point is that we need to get that underway, and so that we can buy time with other measures until that climate change mitigation starts to kick in and have an effect. And the reason that's so important is that climate change is actually connected to multiple threat mechanisms that we've talked about today in this presentation, including the probability of large fire events themselves. And we'll hear a little bit more about that in subsequent talks. It's very important to reduce the risks of fire occurrence, and we can do that by managing ignitions in particular, as well as managing fuels. And at the moment, in recent times, most of our effort's been on managing fuels. And it's actually important, but it's the least effective mechanism that we have, because these big fires depend more than anything else on climate, both in the sense of fire weather on the day and also in terms of the fuel moisture. And managing the ignitions is very important in terms of being ready and surveillance on the sources of those fires, so that we have suppression capability to jump on them as soon as they start. And finally, we need to be much more ready to manage the post-fire threats that come after. And I'm thinking here particularly about invasive species. A major fire event is a cue to get out there and manage weeds and feral animals before they have a major impact on the sensitive post-fire regrowth. Thanks very much for listening.
Cheers, thank you, David. Moving swiftly along to our next speaker. Really lucky to have Rebecca Gibson with us today. Rebecca is a remote sensing research scientist with the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. I'm sure Beck will give an introduction, but she has a background in fire and landscape ecology. She now works for DPI in remote sensing on monitoring vegetation change over time. So yeah, over to you, Beck.
Thank you, Guy. Onto my slides. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll be talking about remote sensing of fire in research and applications in New South Wales government operations. Next slide, thanks. At DPI, we have a key piece of infrastructure, this supercompute facility. It supports most of my research and development, and it's a high performance petascale compute storage and networking infrastructure. It has a lot of, it's a source of truth for a lot of our New South Wales government environmental data, and a lot of partner agencies and organisations both use it and contribute to its maintenance. And the remote sensing team in DPI are a key user and manager of the system. So it's really been a key piece of infrastructure for a lot of my work. It houses our archive of satellite imagery, which is key to my remote sensing of fire. Next slide, please. So remote sensing of fire really takes advantage of this difference in the spectral response curve between healthy vegetation and burned areas. There's this classic drop in the near infrared space in the post-fire environment, and a rise in the shortwave infrared spectral wavelengths. So fire severity is a metric of the biomass consumed by fire, and it's different to fire intensity, but clearly related in a lot of ways. But fire intensity is the actual energy rate of output at the time of a fire, and fire severity is that post-fire, immediate post-fire metric of consumption of the biomass. So these classic normalized burn ratio and derived indices take advantage of that difference in reflectance curves that happen in that post-fire environment. Next slide, please. So the New South Wales Fire Extent and Severity Mapping Program was a result of several years, 2 or 3 years of research and development going into the design and construction. So it's a remote sensing based estimate of fire severity. It's a supervised classification initially developed on Sentinel-2 satellite imagery using a random forest algorithm. And the severity class labels and descriptions are presented here. So it's a 5-class system moving through unburnt, low severity where there's a burnt understory and an unburnt canopy, moderate severity, which is partial canopy scorch, high severity is full canopy scorch and partial consumption, and extreme severity is full canopy consumption. It's trained on a suite of aerial high resolution post-fire aerial photography and this is an example of those severity classes. So next slide, please. Throughout the development of the system, we've gone through a set of version updates. So the initial algorithm was trained on 4 key input indices across 8 case study fires from 2016-17 and 2017-18 fire seasons on about 65,000 training data points. And so those are the initial balanced accuracy metrics for that first version. The second version was a development of 12 input indices. So we refined the modelling, refined the algorithm with these texture-based image, it's like computer vision type indices, and still trained on those initial case study fires with a modest increase in training data points. And version 3 came after the 2019-20 bushfires and was able to massively increase the training data based on case studies in that actual season. And you can see the increases again due to that wider coverage of training data. So in particular, throughout that version updates process, we were able to increase the accuracies around the low and moderate severity classes. Oh, sorry. Wasn't quite ready for that slide progression. If you could go back one. Okay, so I wanted to just make the point there that with rapid tech development and to incorporate that into government operations, which really have a drive for the need for best available information. Now we really need to adopt this appetite for ongoing, model development and accuracy improvements, and also to incorporate an uncertainty measure in a lot of, our operations. So I think this is really an important point, and it's an area that we could make a lot of improvements on, I think. Now ready for the next slide. A key part of the goal of the Fism project was to apply it to the historical archive. So it involved a modification of the algorithm to support application onto the Landsat archives, where it required, just due to the different wavelengths in the different sensors, it requires separate training. And so these are the metrics of, a comparison between Sentinel-2 and Landsat, and you can see the difference in resolution there, but really strong alignment between the severity classes, and it really supports that ability to map the historic archive, really supports greater fire management decisions, like looking at the efficacy of past hazard reduction burns and wildfires on reducing fire size and severity, and other landscape and fire ecology research questions. Next slide, please. We've developed a Fism operational system. So through collaboration with the RFS, who was a key partner in developing this program, we have this operational system where between our two agencies, we have infrastructure talking to each other. So basically there's an input trigger coming from RFS's key fire management database system, ICON. So automated requesting to Amazon S3 bucket that is monitored from DPI. So then we draw down the input data that has been triggered, and we do the in-house processing of the fire severity mapping through a largely automated system, but we do have several quality assurance manual checks, back again, to ensure accuracy and that before we deliver it back. Sorry, I'm just a bit thrown by the slides. Could you go back a slide? Thank you. So this system was launched in July 2020, and we back processed that 2019-20 fire season, as well as a couple of previous fire years to assist in comparisons. But really our goal now is in both directions, delivering ongoing fire mapping in near real time moving forward in the current season and future seasons, as well as back processing recent past as well as deeper historical fires. So that is a big undertaking, and for the historical fires, we're starting a process of rolling out through priority areas. Next slide, please. That's a lot of work through with our partners in national parks. So through the past sort of couple of years of development of this system, we're now moving into an annual reporting framework. So for each fire year, we're reporting on these type of metrics, and the data each year is published on our key infrastructure for government environmental data delivering to the public. And summary reports, the summary report and data spreadsheets will be available in a routine way each year. So now we can move forward to the next slide. So some of the key management applications have included national parks rapid response teams have been using the data to prioritise post-fire impacts and risk assessments on the ground. DPI have used the data to go and, sorry, I'm just a bit thrown, I'm trying my hardest, to look on the ground to plan for field surveys to locate threatened species populations. And the EPA have used it to inform forestry logging operations. And there's been a lot of other applications like monitoring. Next slide, please. Sorry, that was a bad slide. So since the data has been newly available at this kind of scale, there is a lot of emerging applications that are under early development. And again, in government operations, I think we really need an appetite for this, rapid uptake of new research and operationalizing new research, but this kind of ongoing support and investment in the further development of applications. Sorry, back a slide. So yes, there's a lot of work to still do in the area of applying severity data in hazard reduction, burn planning. We're working closely with national parks in integrating severity data in an operational sense into their key software, fire tools, and as well as working closely with national parks and RFS to incorporate the severity data into like fire behaviour predictions and analysis. Okay, next slide now. Yeah, as well as, so I mentioned before that historical severity mapping, and as an example, working closely with national parks to support developing ecological fire reporting metrics, using a lot of the historical data for case study areas, and next click, to develop these time series derived products on such as 30-year sort of product of canopy fire frequency, next click, and time since fire, and as well as unburnt refugia. So now next one. Sorry. We'll go to the last slide, thanks. So we do have a vision of a complete remote sensing system of mapping fire. Not quite ready to finish yet. Just back one slide if you could. So through these component parts of a system, a complete system of remote sensing of fire that we've been working towards for several years. It would include the fire detection aspect, which is coming from integration with hotspot detections and doing a lot of collaborative work with GA and Landgate in that space. Fire progression mapping and exploring the potential for radar integration with optical sensors, and that's through a lot of collaborations with the UNSW and Joint Remote Sensing Research Program. Obviously the severity mapping component, which while developed in terms of an operational capacity, we still have a lot of work to do in both directions of mapping current season and past seasons, and really developing the applications around severity mapping. And also a lot of research in the space around post-fire spectral recovery monitoring. That's been supported by the NRC, and certainly potential to leverage with the fire extent severity mapping system. And yeah, I guess a key kind of point just to end on there is that following the 2019-20 season and the bushfire inquiry recommendations, a lot of these components, parts of a remote sensing system are coming through in some of those recommendations, and we have received some funding to further support this work. Thank you very much for the invitation to present here. I apologise for those slides and happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Beck, and thank you so much for your patience as our own little post-fire invasive bug just got into the system and seemed to be speeding everything up much more than we all wanted. So yeah, thank you for your patience. Over to our final speaker, Hamish Clark. Hamish is a research fellow at the Centre for Environmental Risk Management of Bushfires at the University of Wollongong and works as part of the Eureka Prize-winning New South Wales Bushfire Risk Management Research Hub. Hamish is also a treasured fellow member of the IUCN Oceania Regional Committee and the master creator behind today's webinar. So thank you, Hamish, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Guy, and to my past speakers today. Really interesting talks and a nice lead into. I'm going to try and zoom through this a bit, so we'll see how we go with the tech and me rushing, but I hope to leave a little bit of time for questions at the end. Next slide, please, Mariana. In 15 minutes, so actually I'm going to aim for 10, I hope to tell you a little bit about climate change and bushfires and perhaps how we can think about it. So I thought I'd start with my take-home messages. If you could just advance one click, please. The first one, as you have seen, is that fire is incredibly complex. It doesn't behave the same everywhere, and the fire regime is a really useful concept, a kind of an anchor for you, if you like. Start with a coherent area where you know fires are behaving in a certain way, and think about what climate change could do to them. I think a really useful lens for looking at that is the biophysical drivers of fire, which I'll elaborate on. Next click, please. And those drivers, things like the amount of fuel and the fuel moisture, they all respond to climate and not all in the same way. So the strength of the link, the complexity, the time scale at which it unfolds is going to vary across those things, which makes predicting it all difficult. Some changes we've already seen, others, we're expecting to see, and others we're uncertain about. Next click, please. An important one, which I think comes across well from all three talks really, is that rare but extreme events can have a disproportionate impact. If you're tracking something like the amount of high severity fire in a system over a period of time, it can be the case that just a single fire or a couple of fires account for almost all of the impacts, even if there's been many other fires of smaller size during that time. Obviously, it depends what you're talking about, but it's something to bear in mind with extreme events and climate change. Next click, please. And although it's not my area of expertise, humans are inextricably linked to fire in so many ways, from cultural burning and prescribed fire, planning settlements, building homes, fighting fires, preparing and defending a house, and many other areas that even though I'm not focusing on it here, we can't forget about the all-important human factor. Next slide, please. So just to zoom out a bit, and we've already had a few nice global pictures, but this one is a picture of essentially how often areas get burnt every year. It's from satellite imagery, and it's for a period at the start of this millennium. And what you can see pretty quickly is that fires don't affect all areas equally. There are some sections like Northern Australia, parts of Africa, that are burning a really high amount every year. This isn't the same as necessarily a high intensity fire, but in terms of the frequency, there's an amazing amount of diversity across the planet. And some of the areas that we think of as fire prone, on average, may not burn that much each year. Next slide, please. I'm very grateful to David for already showing this slide, but I'll just harp on it again. The fire regime is such a useful concept and such incredible diversity just in Australia, let alone throughout Oceania and the rest of the world. So next click, please. What we see is that what matters in a fire regime, these kind of key ingredients, what's the kind of fire you get? Is it a woody fuel, kind of forest fires? Is it grassy? How often do they happen and how intense are they? And they're often kind of inversely proportional. So in the north of the country, you might get more frequent fires that tend to be less intense than some of the fires we get in the tall forests in the southwest and southeast. The seasonality is another interesting aspect, and one that we don't have a great handle on with climate change. how is the timing of fires going to change? So that's fairly complex, but broadly speaking, it tends to start earlier in the north, you know, kind of around winter, and then by spring we're burning in kind of southeast Queensland, northeast New South Wales, and as we move further down we get into summer and even early autumn. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the biophysical drivers of fire, and I think they're a really useful way of thinking about how climate change could influence bushfires. So this is based on some work from Sally Archibald and colleagues, as well as Ross Bradstock, kind of independently proposing these drivers or switches, with the idea being that they're each necessary but not sufficient. You need all four together to get this fire happening. And those switches on the left, we have fuel, vegetation that's kind of, there's enough of it and it's connected across the landscape to actually carry a fire. As we've heard up top, fuel moisture is absolutely critical. If the fuel is not dry enough to burn, then you're in a very different picture. If there's pockets of the landscape that are normally wet that aren't, you can get some of the massive fires that we've seen. Again, having the fuel and the fuel moisture is not enough though. Generally, you want to have the fire weather conditions. So that's on the right-hand side. Classic, hot, dry, windy, although it's certainly more complicated than that. And then lastly, but not least, an ignition source. And there's very many different ignition sources. Next slide, please. Basically, when you put all these things together, that's when you can get a major landscape fire. Next slide, please. So those different switches, I've listed them again on the left, and we have a time scale on the x-axis. Just click through once, please. So you can see that the switches are all operating at different scales, not just temporal scales, but spatial scales too. And so any changes that happen in them are going to play out also over a different time period. So broadly speaking, we have fuel plants, you know, can take up to centuries to evolve, although some of them can move much more rapidly in some arid areas, for example, after a rainfall. That fuel moisture tending to change on a much shorter time scale, working our way all the way up to ignitions, which of course can happen in a split second. So if you're thinking about climate change effects on these switches, on these drivers, you're also thinking about the different rate at which those changes are going to unfold. So before I wind up, I thought I'd do a quick fire tour, if you'll pardon the pun, of what we know so far about climate change effects on these four drivers. Next slide, please. So the first one, vegetation, not my area of expertise, but we do have some good people here you can ask about. I would just say the picture is really complex. Plants, you know, and ecosystems respond to a number of elements of the climate system. They respond to rainfall, temperature, various permutations of those things, such as frequency and intensity of rain events. They respond to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They obviously also respond to soil, many other factors. So I wouldn't confidently state that I could say exactly what climate change is going to do to the vegetation types in all these different fire regimes. But we certainly have some clues, and they're again going to depend partly on a lot of local factors. Next slide, please. Fuel moisture is a bit simpler, it's still pretty complicated. You can divide it into dead fuel and live fuel. So things like leaves and twigs on the ground are your dead fuel moisture, and they're a lot easier to model. We have some pretty good models for some areas now where we can predict the moisture of the fuel from climate variables like temperature and humidity. Live fuel moisture, again, you're bringing in biology, physiology, soil moisture, things like that. So it's a bit more complicated. However, we've seen from both observations and climate change projections, quite a lot of signs pointing to the potential for increased frequency of fuel drying below a kind of a critical threshold. Next slide, please. Fire weather conditions, probably the one that I have most familiarity with. There's a number of different fire danger ratings, which bring in things like surface temperature, surface humidity, wind speed. Unfortunately, most of the projections show the potential for these to increase considerably under climate change. There are always some regions and models where that's not the case, but certainly the weight of risk is pointing towards strongly increased fire weather conditions, which again, unfortunately, is consistent with changes that we've already seen historically. Certainly not just in Australia, but all around the world. There are other elements to fire weather as well. So there's a lot of interest in fire storms, so-called pyroconvective events. and the conditions for them. Also some evidence, unfortunately, that they could become more likely under climate change. Next click, please. Last one, ignitions. Lightning is our main natural source. We don't have a huge amount of evidence. I'm pretty sure I've seen, some signs pointing both ways, possibly a few more suggesting the potential for more lightning, but I think there's a little bit more that needs to be done. Of course, humans are, the elephant in the room there. We cause a lot of ignitions, whether by accident or on purpose. One thing you could say about that, though, is those ignitions are more likely to result in a fire when the other switches are on and when the fire weather particularly is severe. So if we're seeing more fire weather, then we're probably going to see more ignitions related to humans too. So that's a quick tour of some of the main drivers of fire and climate change. And I might wind it up there and pass back to Guy to organise the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hamish. Thank you for being so efficient with that body of content. Yeah, next slide. So we're just going to in the 10 minutes that we have remaining, I'll ask all of the speakers to put their videos if they're still around. I'd like to try and have some time for all of us to have a question. Please continue to feed through questions through the chat function. If we don't have time, we'll try and get back to you with answers after the event. Just going back to Den, in terms of the role of Aboriginal people in bushfire management, and I think he did a really fantastic job in trying to show these differences between cultural burning practices and more recent hazard reduction strategies. But just trying to get your thoughts in terms of the role of Aboriginal people in the latter.
Well, the cultural burning has really only become a catchphrase, to be honest, in the last 10 years, but particularly in response to the 2019-20 wildfires, when it really got talked up, and when we received some favourable press, if you like, from cultural burn that we'd undertaken some 3 or 4 years before the wildfire swept over a property that we were doing cultural burning on. So it's largely still a bit of a mystery to most Australians as to what it is. And as I said, I often get asked the question, what's the difference? But ultimately for me, it is about acknowledging the fact that Aboriginal people, as I said in my presentation, used fire to, enhance the landscape, and they lived in, they lived that reality every day. They lived on country, and their connection to country was there, and their knowledge of that country was there. So my aspiration for the future is to give Aboriginal people, start giving that back to them, to that opportunity for them to be able to reconnect and carry out a practice just as they would any other cultural practice. But unfortunately, there's a lot that stands in the way, and a lot of that is around, approval processes, the scientific arguments around the frequencies of fires, and whether fire is, cultural fire is of any use or of any importance. I know my presentation wasn't perhaps as scientific, and certainly not backed up by a lot of data and that sort of thing. I can only, explain, the cultural practice of cultural burning from a practitioner's point of view. And for me, ultimately, it's about getting on country and getting on with it. And that's basically what I and a number of other practitioners around New South Wales, and certainly they've been doing it up in the northern parts of Australia for decades. We've got a long way to catch up, but it's no less relevant for this part of Australia, regardless of, the population levels and the huge development areas of development and infrastructure that we have down in this part of Australia. So did I answer the question?
Yeah, you did. I'll open it up to anyone else from the panel as well if you had any comments on the same question. There is a question that's just come here through for David, but I think it is relevant to all of the speakers from different perspectives that you bring. It's around how we best prepare for future extreme fire events, to reduce risk. And I think some of your answer there, Dan, also kind of played into answering that from an Aboriginal management perspective. But David, I suppose more from a reducing risk to ecosystems, how do we kind of best prepare for what lies ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, all good.
Oh, great. Yeah, look, I think given that interactions seem to be so important between, between any individual fire and everything else that's going on in the landscape, we can perhaps get a bit fixated on fire of itself and single fire events. And I think, we've seen that in 2019-20. And in order to, deal with the negative consequences of events like that, I think, taking the load off everywhere else as much as we can is really important. So, for example, a lot of the issues that we uncovered in our study relate to the recent history of fire, relatively recent history of fire, and whether there were fires in the right, should I say, whether there's a succession of similar fires of similar severity. Multiple high severity fires in succession is a bad thing for most ecosystems and a lot of the biota that live in them. And you can say the same about high frequency fires without much time for recovery between them. And one issue that I didn't really cover very much because it just happens to be not one of the forefront issues at the forefront at the moment in most of the landscapes that were burnt is low frequency fire. There are some systems that actually do depend on being burnt in particular kinds of fire regimes, and that was really not too much of an issue when we were actually focused on studying. Our brief was to study the effects of that event and the things that affected the response. So there's a whole range of things that can be done as a consequence. And, two things that stand out for me are being ready to deal with, the post-fire environment. And, the post-fire environment usually provides the best opportunities that we have to control feral animals, both predators and herbivores, and also deal with weeds as well. Because if we don't, those things can readily get away. And there's lots of examples where that's happened in past fires and really had a much greater impact than they otherwise would have. So being ready, thinking that, the next event is going to come, what do we do when it does, is really important. And I think, that you can think the same way about preventing, too many major fire events. And that is, what can we do with the things that are proximal? And the two things out of the four switches that Hamish mentioned are ignitions and fuel levels. And as I mentioned earlier, we're actually doing a bit on fuel levels and probably increasing that effort. And, we've got to look at different ways and thinking about how Indigenous management approaches can influence, different goals there for managing fuels. And at the same token, we've got to think much more, I think, about being proactive and managing ignitions. And, where I live, there's been a change in the last decade where they've taken a much more proactive approach to managing ignitions and risks, getting patrols around, surveillance on high danger days, closing areas and having community observers out and about. All of that stuff means that you detect fire earlier and you can attack it earlier with suppression, and being ready to do that as well. Thanks.
I think in the couple of minutes we have, I might actually keep that question open. Beck or Hamish, any thoughts from you in terms of how we can best prepare for those future extreme fire events from the work that you're involved in?
Beck, do you want to go first?
I guess from a remote sensing point of view, it's really in those key areas where we're working to incorporate fire severity information into those fire management tools. The fire National Parks and Wildlife fire tools, they've been doing a lot of work in the last 5 years to enhance the applications of that software to better deal with risk management, and I think severity data can be incorporated better into that. And but yeah, I guess it's that investment in those greater applications of remote sensing, in terms of what I think we can do with remote sensing data. We're working on it. Thank you.
Hamish, final word?
Yeah, so I'd say number one, it would be, strong urgent action on climate change, like David said. Let's try and cut away at that force. But then too, I think the lens of risk is very widely acknowledged as a really important one for managing fires. So it's just to keep working on that, likelihood and consequence. What are the chances of fires happening? What are the chances of these various drivers being in these states, or various, fire regimes being in a certain condition? So that requires a lot of understanding of what's driving these things, and then the consequences as well. So, and that brings in a lot of natural as well as human things. So we've got a good framework for it. It's just a matter of putting it into practice and addressing some of the gaps, I think.
Dan, I have to kind of give you the microphone for this one. I think it relates to your presentation. Any kind of thoughts in relation to preparing for those events?
Well, with all due respect to everyone that's presented, and we talk about the scientific measurements of things, and we talk about being proactive. Sorry. Actually, we've talked about being reactive to when a fire actually starts out, whether it be through a lightning strike or something, and being on top of it and deploying our remote area fire teams to get on top of it. And the fact is that country is still waiting to burn. It may be by way of another second lightning strike in, near vicinity. I'm very much an advocate for being proactive, and that's where I'm coming from in the cultural burning space. And cultural burning knowledge is, we're happy, as I stated in my presentation, it's something that we want to share with all Australians. We are all living here now. And I would really want to see us empowering communities to take responsibility for not only their own properties that that individuals live on, but for communities. And that might sound rather absurd that you would entrust fire management to locals, but I don't think it's much different than having this reactive response by the fire and rescue little red trailers that are parked out on the corner, once again waiting in response or reacting to a fire event. We need to shift our mindset to one that is more proactive than reactive, and that's getting in first and taking care of that country that needs burning the right way to avoid being impacted by the wildfires. And we're a long way off achieving that, but as I said in my presentations, we have to start with Aboriginal people leading that process. We're happy to share it and bring all Australians along with us. It might sound very fanciful, and I'm not trying to romanticize it, but I think it even starts with our young ones, and children and adults alike were traumatized by these events. There's an overt fear of fire. We need to change that mindset. I think we need to all be responding to this issue, and we've got climate change right at the back of us, but on top of that, we still need to do something about the fire issue. So I'm very much about trying to engage all of Australians in this conversation, and then certainly within this practice. That's me.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate all of your inputs. We have run over time. I think it's a conversation that probably for all of us is very active. We could continue on for a long time. Thank you so much to all of the presenters today. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for your patience in dealing with a few technical issues as we've gone. Thank you for Peter and for IUCN CEM for hosting the event. As I've shared through the chat, there's a YouTube channel where this will be made available. Please get in touch with CEM in relation to both this event and ongoing webinars in the series. We hope you've enjoyed the event, and it's, as I said, it's one of an ongoing webinar series that we're developing at the moment. and look forward to staying in touch. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, Guy.